Let's talk about what happens in a room. Like, let's say the room I'm standing in, okay? There's two sets of parallel walls, parallel floor and ceiling. Obviously, I'm creating some energy disturbance in the air when I talk, and the sound waves are bouncing off the walls, reflecting off the wall at the same angle that it comes in at to the wall. If a sound is generated in a room, it'll bounce off this wall, and then off that wall, and then off this wall, and back and forth, just like a ping pong ball in a box. If it has enough energy, it'll keep bouncing back and forth until it dies away. Okay, so let's talk about what a standing wave is. Standing waves, parallel reflective walls will create standing waves with wavelengths that are multiples of the distance between the walls. So now we talked about what the wavelength is, right? It's a length, so it's an actual distance. Let's say these walls are exactly one wavelength, that the wall on the left and the wall on the right are one wavelength distant of each other. And it's called a standing wave. It creates a standing wave. So that frequency is actually accented in the room. So each room has specific frequencies that actually get promoted in the room because of the size, physical shape of the room and size of the room, and certain frequencies that are diminished, because if this happened to be a half of a wavelength distance, then it would bounce off and bounce back, and it would start diminishing that particular frequency. So there's nodes and antinodes. So the room can support a sound wave whose wavelength is up to twice the dimension of the room. An example of a standing wave, which is here. This is very similar to what happens in all rooms. Let's say somebody was telling me about their home studio room and where to place their speakers. So if the room is small, there's enough energy coming off the speakers to actually reflect off the back wall and then reflect off the front wall and bounce around in the room. In a room this size, it takes a lot of energy to get the sound to actually have enough energy to make more than a couple reflections, because it's diminishing in its power. Just like you can imagine in your head, you're shooting pool and you hit the ball really hard and it bounces around 4 times before it comes to a stop. If you hit it softer, less energy, and the same pool table, it'll only have enough energy to bounce off 2 bumpers perhaps. Okay, because it starts diminishing in power as it reflects. The reflection off of a wall actually makes the sound energy, or the energy in the sound wave, start to diminish. And let's just say that the size of the room is such that the reflections actually reinforce that particular frequency. Then you get a ringing at that frequency. But there are certain frequencies that actually will cancel each other out and be 180 degrees out of phase when they reflect off the walls, and you get something that's more like a comb filter. So certain frequencies will cancel each other out. What I'm getting at is that the sound you hear in a specific room size, even if I'm generating the same sound and I change sizes of rooms, it's going to sound different in every room, just slightly, because of the way the room interacts with the sound. And that's the challenge of what a studio is. The control room of a studio is built in a way that hopefully, if it's done correctly, the room doesn't affect the sound as much, so that the listener can have a more accurate understanding of what they're hearing from the speakers. But in reality, most people listen in cars, they listen in headphones, they listen in rooms like this, they listen in bedrooms that are rectangular or square and with parallel walls and reflective surfaces and all that. And so the sound is affected by the room you're listening in. And the louder you listen in a small room, the more affected the sound is. Right? So if you're listening in your home studio and it's a small room, I tend to turn the sound down, because then the room interacts a lot less with what I'm trying to hear. But that makes sense, right? As we mentioned before, just step into the bathroom and sing a note. It's going to sound way different than if you step into your closet and sing a note. The room affects the sound, and that's important to understand. Some other things about frequencies. Let's say we've got 2 different frequencies, and they're far enough apart that can be added together, right? You've got 2 different frequencies being created. You can actually perceive 2 different specific tones. Let's say these 2 frequencies are not very far apart from each other. Maybe 1,000 hertz and 1,500 hertz instead of 1,000 hertz and 3,000 hertz. Let's say that they're getting closer and closer together. Different principles occur when these 2 frequencies are added together. So beat frequencies are created when 2 frequencies are summed together that are close to each other. The number of beats per second is equal to the difference in frequency, hertz or cycles, between the two frequencies. This is what is an example of a beat frequency. Guitar players use this principle all the time when they tune their guitars. You hit a harmonic on the E string and a harmonic on the A string, and they're supposed to be the same harmonic that you're hearing, the bell-like sound from the guitar, and then you tune the guitar, you hear the beat frequencies getting closer and closer and faster, and then when it's in tune, the beat frequencies go away. Hey, how do you get a guitar player to turn down? Put music in front of him. Sorry. This is one of my studio jokes. Okay, so that's beat frequencies. Masking frequencies. Now this is an important principle when we start doing mixing and start discussing mixing of different sounds together. So when you have two frequencies that are relatively the same and equal volume, they tend to mask each other. Low frequencies have a tendency to mask each other. That's why it's very difficult to mix low frequencies and not get something that sounds muddy but still defined. So you can hear the bass drum and you can hear the bass guitar and you can hear the bass end of a piano all distinctly. It's very difficult sometimes because the frequencies are very close together and they mask each other. When I mean masking, it's almost like blanketing over so you can't even hear the other one. I'm sure anybody that's tried to mix their own EDM piece of music understands this with the bass and the kick. But this frequency masking is also used in other situations. For example, when you go into a doctor's office and you're in a waiting room and they've got the wave machine going, generating pretty much white noise in the waiting room, they do that for a reason. They do that because, not to relax you like you're at the ocean, but some of them actually have like birds, and all that stuff in those. But the reason that they use that kind of a sound in the waiting room is because they want to mask whatever frequencies and whatever sounds are coming from another room. So if the doctor's in the other room talking to another patient, they don't want the patients in the waiting room hearing what's going on. So they put this in the waiting room, and it's this sort of wave-like sound, but basically what it does is it's low enough level that it masks whatever frequencies are coming through from the other room. So you can't quite understand or hear what's happening in the other room. That's a great example of using this principle of frequency masking in a commercial setting that's not musical. But when we get to mixing, frequency masking is a really important principle to understand because we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to avoid frequency masking so we can hear all the frequencies distinctly in all the different sound elements. So that's masking frequencies. We talked about beat frequencies. Let's talk about reverberation. Like in a gymnasium or a stairwell that's concrete. I used to play guitar in a stairwell that was concrete. It sounded so great because there was tons of reverb. It sort of is this bouncing around of the sound waves so much that it just becomes this wash of sound, and it makes everything sound really good. So in acoustics, reverberation is the building up of random fields of sound waves that result from a sound wave reflecting in a space. When a source is stopped, these waves that are bouncing around in a room will eventually stop, just like the billiard ball slows down and stops from bouncing around. Because the energy source is stopped, it'll eventually stop. When a reverb sound goes down 60 decibels from zero, or from its loudest down 60 decibels, it's called the RT60 time. The time it takes for it to decay down 60 decibels is the RT60 time, and that's a time that's used in most rooms to determine how reverberant they are. So when you go on your plugins tonight and you're on your computer and you're playing around with a reverb, the RT60, or the reverb time, is how long it takes for the reverb to decay down 60 decibels from its maximum. So the snare drum hits the reverb and it goes, then it decays. How long it takes to go down 60 decibels so it's virtually not there. An echo is typically thought of as a delay that repeats, where you can hear repeating delays. Like, hello, 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 like the Grand Canyon, right? Because it's so big that the reflection takes so long to get back to you that you can determine it as a reflection. In a gymnasium, it's small enough that the reflections build up, and there's so many random reflections that it becomes almost an endless series of delayed voices. And actually, that's how they create the solid state reverbs, is they take a delay and they tap the delay at different delay times and regenerate them over and over and over, specifically to get different types of sounds, like a gymnasium or a stadium or a concert hall. They have all of those kinds of sounds in the reverb. And they all sound a little different. Reverberation has two main components. There's the early reflection, which is a discrete echo. So the first reflection off the first wall is called the early reflections, and then later it sort of decays into endless series of delay, 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 and more reflections over and over, and becomes the reverb sound. So in your plugin, if you change the early reflection, it actually makes the listener think that the enclosure is larger. So if you wanted to get a drum sound on reverb on your snare drum, and you had an early reflection time that's smaller, it'll sound like you're in a smaller room. If you increase the early reflection time to a larger value, it'll sound like you're more in a stadium, a larger space, right? Because the early reflection time is the discrete time it takes for the first reflection to reach the first wall and come back. RT60 time we just discussed briefly. I went out of order, but generally it's the time that it takes the reverb to decay 60 decibels. And 60 decibels is pretty much, you kind of perceive it as going away completely.